own pocketbooks and take a look at, what's going on around them, it impacts them. But notwithstanding that, they just keep moving forward with the same arguments. And that, I guess, one of the things that I hope we would get to, in this discussion is, this is something that goes on. I mean, we're seeing it in Russia and Ukraine right now, with the politics and the propaganda. What is, how do we get around that and communicate to people what's really going on? So that's my takeaway. Hi, Connie.
Hi, Connie.
Hello.
I just posed the question asking for those that had a chance to read the book, was there one big takeaway that they got? I mean, I'm sure there are many, but one key takeaway. And so a couple people have already spoken. I'm curious as to whether anybody else has something else to add that might be different from what Art and Lindsay may have talked about.
So I have not had an opportunity to read the book.
That's okay. You don't even have to admit it, Connie. I mean, there are people, I'm sure there are people on the call who didn't read it or didn't have a chance to finish it, and it's like no big deal. It's the discussion that's really critical here.
Okay.
I think one thing that really hit me was the idea that in the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act with Lyndon Johnson, that was like this seismic shift in the way in which whites started voting for Republicans versus Democrats. Mm-hmm. And that has not changed now in terms of white America and who they vote for. And it's interesting because I don't know if you remember, some of you may not have been on the call 2 years ago when we had Don Kettle talk about his book regarding really 4 or 5 seismic issues, periods of time in our country in terms of how things have shifted between centralized government, decentralized government where states had rights. And the most recent one he said that was most meaningful was that same time, that same period of time, that same trigger, which was the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts that were passed in the 60s. Oh, wow, Sally's joining us. Cool. So anyway, that to me it's such a powerful statement about how so much has happened actually since the 60s. I mean, and even things like the GI Bill and Social Security and all those things that at pre-1960 were very much to help the middle class, the white middle class, be successful and to become a more stable financial, middle class. And that post 1960, we see a lot of change that has basically meant to create this sort of zero-sum game, right? Where we don't want to share in the wealth, we don't want to share in the opportunities, that in fact it's if you get something, then I lose. But that it seemed like a triggering moment, that period with Johnson. I mean, I would totally love to know if we could ever go back and have a chance to talk to somebody. I would love to know if LBJ or even Kennedy, how they would see where we are today versus where we were back then when they were trying to move us forward as a country. But anyway, that was one of my big takeaways. Welcome, Sally and Franz. I don't know if both of you guys are on, but it's good to see your name anyway on the screen.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Hi, Carol.
Hey, Sally.
The question that I had posed was, for those that had a chance to read the book or finish the book, was there a significant takeaway? Anything that you remember that was really sort of a salient point that you got out of this book after having read it? And I was just mentioning the whole idea that in the 1960s, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts, that we saw a seismic change in where white America chose to vote. that they started voting basically in block to vote Republican rather than Democrat. And I'm not trying to make a political statement about Republicans and Democrats. I just thought that that was really an interesting observation or factual note about how something like the passage of those two major pieces of legislation that maybe many of us think were such a fabulous move towards our country becoming maybe more of what we really want to be. And that's where we saw some changes in terms of white America and how they began to retrench and want to limit the opportunities of people who were not like them.
Hey, Judy, I do have an observation. I think this topic is really very serious because it really goes to how long and the strength of our democracy, going forward. I mean, our democracy is built on citizenship, the right to vote, everybody being treated with respect. And I think what we're seeing now is, groups, internally we're fighting each other. And I think really the analysis and maybe in the book, Ms. McGhee may have brought up the issue that, this isn't anything that's new. I mean, this started with the Constitution, where it was a wonderful document, but it didn't apply to everybody, and it started off that way. Then, of course, there was the Civil War, and I still think, we're living with that. And so the real question, again, as I mentioned before, is how do we deal with this? How do we go back, and deal with a Constitution that was flawed? How do we deal with the Civil War? And Reconstruction didn't work, and we're still living with that. I think that's really all the pieces, and ultimately, I think Ms. McGhee's outcome is that the way we're functioning right now helps nobody. It really hurts us all, but yet, nobody seems to want to deal with that. So with that, I'll get off my soapbox.
I think a part of that is that it would take people to admit like the founding fathers got it wrong, or the federalist system maybe isn't the best way. And that's, I think, like a hard pill to swallow for lots of people.
I mean, I appreciate the part of the thesis of what she's saying is that if we could get ourselves away from talking about color to talking about how everybody wins, how can everyone benefit so that it's a win-win environment, how we can focus on what people need and want that's important to them instead of cutting off people's noses to spite their face for, in many regards, that maybe we could at least begin to address some of the issues that are so deeply dividing the country in an unfair way. So I really appreciated that was her focus in terms of saying, maybe I mean, she didn't say this literally, but if we were just to focus on the things that are important to us all and work together to get those things. And she talks about multiracial coalitions. She talks about commissions that would enable us to maybe work on things together where we would have a shared desired outcome, and we could look past anything that would be traditionally seen as a barrier, right, to us working together. Yeah, and she seems really hopeful that we could do that. I think the question, which is partly what Art you're asking, is, are we in a situation where we can create those kinds of coalitions at a level, a meaningful level, not just maybe at the local level or small level, but at the national level? Are there ways we can create those kinds of coalitions that would have the credibility and the support, the power of voice to make things happen? And I'm kind of curious whether you guys think there are things we could be doing or that the country could be doing to try to create that kind of capability that we don't have now. And if so, what would that look like? How could we do it?
Well, I think there's always been a very strong mistrust of big government, centralized government. I mean, you go all the way back to Hamilton and Jefferson and, the conflict that emerged there. And, basically, this country has revolted against any government that tries to impose a common will on all of the people, because it somehow is perceived to infringe on their rights. And, the right to do this, the right to do that, how dare government impose this? So I think what we're battling here is this, very strong cultural mistrust in big government, and the fact that people are not going to buy that. It doesn't square with their own prejudices, to be honest with you. We saw it in the 60s, when certain civil rights legislations were passed, there was a huge backlash. I remember the argument, so often, well, she got it only because, she was fill in the blank, in spite of this person's qualifications. And I didn't read the book, so I apologize. I hope I'm not, getting into some deep water here that's not really covered, but it's been a perpetual problem in this country. We're still facing it. I ran into some Tea Party people once, and I didn't know what they were protesting, and they just said big government, and I thought, okay, here we go again. I didn't think that this would, well up as big as it has become. The Tea Party is kind of defunct, but there are other splinter groups that are, offshoots of that hate big government and the rules. And they'll make up, a lot of stories about how ineffective government is, and they can't do this and blah, blah, blah. But I think that's one of the big issues that we as a nation have to confront time and time again. And we all are in some way associated with government. So, that's where our biases are, but we have to face constituents that don't share our views. And it's unfortunate.
I mean, I think the thing that was interesting in her book was that she actually suggests that the white majority likes big government when they benefit from it. Right? And when there's any reason that they feel suddenly government is not for them, almost exclusively for them, that's when they want small government. And so part of what I interpreted was, again, this is sort of that 1960s movement, the real push to have, when sort of the idea of the common good or the public good, that word public got a change in definition. Public good before the 60s, before civil rights and voting rights, the public good was considered the white majority public. When public good became, what are we trying to do after this, during the 60s and beyond, to ensure that there's equity across programs, across government, to serve all the people, that's when the definition of public changed. And so that's why at least I've interpreted some of what she was talking about. So I think it's interesting, because I think that big government, small government, it's all based on who benefits. Just like, it's interesting that she tackles this whole issue of fiscal conservatism, right? And the idea that being fiscally conservative is like a good thing, but it's only a good thing, again, if it's ensuring that not everybody gets a piece of the pie. And so it's pretty much who benefits in terms of what government, what they like or don't like about government.
Hey, Judy, you know, also, and kind of piggybacking off of what Linda pointed out earlier about the financial piece of it and how that's played out. You know, another thing that struck me is the biggest affirmative action program that's been implemented to this country was the result of, you know, at the end of World War II in the GI Bill, which basically created the middle class. And it was primarily for, for the white soldiers and, people involved that came in were able to buy homes. But, African Americans, the government redlined them in their neighborhood, so they couldn't get the loans. They couldn't get the guaranteed loans. And so that's the piece as well. I mean, that when you think about it, the pushback on affirmative action, which came later with, Lyndon Johnson and what have you, the pushback, well, hey, this is a handout. It's almost like we forget, the history of what happened, with the GI Bill, which was a good thing. I mean, they built a lot of roads. I mean, there was a lot good in it, but it wasn't for everybody. And at the time, well, I won't say nobody, there were people that complained, but the people with power to make a difference didn't really complain about it. So anyway, I just wanted to give Linda, some propers there, because that was an important point, I think, in the book.
Yeah. I guess I had not really thought about the GI Bill and the VA loan program. It just hadn't hit me how restrictive, how discriminatory those two programs were. And, I did a lot of homeless work back in the 80s and 90s. But in the 70s, that's really when we started seeing the real growth of homelessness. And a lot of people equated homelessness to our change in mental health policy, where we were starting to deinstitutionalize a lot of people, and we didn't have an infrastructure to support people who really needed to be in halfway houses or didn't need to be in 24-hour institutional care. But that was also a period when a lot of people were coming back from Vietnam. And I wondered, and of course, right now, and well, for the last 30 years, a huge percentage of our homeless population are veterans. I began to think, as I was reading her book, whether there was a real difference in the demographics of our military between World War II and Vietnam, and whether that actually also impacted on what kind of support we're willing to give to our returning military, whether part of what's happened was, again, a constraining of less support given to returning military because of this notion that, well, they're not all white. And so, we need to cut back. We don't need to give as much. We don't need to be doing as much to help those returning veterans. And I think since then, we still haven't been doing as much. In fact, I don't feel that VA, and you all may be much more familiar with some of these, because I don't know, Nancy, what your background is. And I know we just lost Meghna for a second, but whether anybody has any real knowledge. Well, Connie, your husband certainly probably knows something about VA. I don't know about the history of VA with regard to this, but I'm just curious as to whether some of the other ills of our society are also tied to this notion that if it's not just for the white majority, then let's do less.
I mean, he may know, he works for the Veterans Benefits Administration. So he kind of have some idea, and I guess they do a lot of statistics on some of those programs. So he may know more about the background on some of the issues that you're referring to. those. I'm not familiar with them, but I'm sure he may have a lot of some of the history on that.
So talk to me about the zero sum game. Talk to me about how you reacted to that issue and what that means to where we are as a country.
Are you talking to me, Judy?
To anybody.
Oh, okay, because I was
you can
like,
speak
I
up, but
know
to
I didn't
anybody.
read the book.
Yeah, no, I mean, she makes the point that pretty much we have a society that is pretty much driven by a zero sum game or a zero sum theory, which is that there are winners and losers, right? We don't have a win-win culture here, win-win society. And I mean, part of, I think, what she's posing is, why don't we? What would it take for us to go from a zero sum or win-lose to a win-win? She may not quite use those words, but to me, that is in part what she is suggesting, is that we need to move to a win-win approach to problem solving, because then everyone sees that they benefit from it and that nobody does lose.
Yeah, I was thinking about that paradigm, and like I had to like Google it, and like I read like the game theory like explanation of it, because it almost seems like we're in like not even like a zero sum game, but like a negative sum game that, like, you know what I mean? Like we're like, white people are willing to take losses, so people of color also lose. So like it seems like it's not just zero, like it seems like we're just like in the negative constantly, if that makes sense. Like that's how I was like,
Yeah.
thinking about it in my mind.
Nobody wins, basically.
Yeah. And something also I was like, I guess have thought about a lot, like thinking about these things, like, well, why do people like specifically vote in a way that hurts them? Like in terms of like social programming and stuff like that, a lot of people who vote on one side of the aisle are taking things away from them that they need. And I've always like a lot of, and I grew up in the South, and like in the rural South, so I saw a lot of poverty from all different walks of life. And like I've always kind of rationalized it in my head that a lot of people were like one issue voters. Like there are people that, because of abortion, they will vote. It doesn't matter what they think about anything else. Like that's how they're going to vote. And, that does tend to be conservative. So I guess like her book did make me think that like, well, maybe it's not just that, like and somehow those things are like tied together somehow. I don't know, like that was just like stuff this book has kind of made me like, I've been like noodling in my mind.
Nancy, do you want to weigh in?
Sorry, it took me a minute to get to unmute there. No, I have to say I did not read the book as well. I mean, I have tried to educate myself on the issue. I read the Color of Law and White Fragility and 2/3 of the way of how to be an anti-racist. And so some of the issues that you all folk that brought up, I do, for those who read the Color of Law, did talk about some of that. Some of that same thing as far as the financial piece of it and the redlining and the impact of certain policies. So when I have to think of certain policies that were really really geared towards benefiting white people, and one of the big ones has been, and I'm a white woman. One of the big ones has been the mortgage deduction
Oh,
for
yeah.
homeowners,
Uh-huh.
and so that's I mean, that was just really geared from the onset toward benefiting white homeowners. And that's a policy, it's an entitlement policy, and it's a policy that remains. And I think people don't recognize it for what it is. I mean, there's this whole kind of set of policies that are continuing. And even though, you know, people talk about some of the ills of some of these entitlement programs, there's this huge entitlement program that just is not, for some reason, is not lumped in with the others. So it's good to be able to kind of to recognize all of it.
Mhm.
And I could, you know, I don't want to put my camera. I feel like I should, because I hate looking at not a picture, but I'm holding my phone in my hand, and I'm afraid I'll make you all dizzy if I move and it's up and down.
No, that's okay. I appreciate you being on, though. Yeah, mortgage interest deduction. What a powerful tool for middle class wealth building, and what a absolutely biased benefit to, you know, leaving out a huge proportion of our society without any sort of equivalent opportunity if you can't buy a house.
Hey, Judy, I'd like to, you know, add another thought to the conversation here as well. And I think she may have mentioned this in the book as well. Again, you know, going back to the beginning, you know, and I think the philosopher, you know, who was really influential to the founding fathers was John Locke. And, you know, as I recall, Locke's principle was, you know, very consistent with, if you can't, you know, protect what you have, then you probably don't need to have it. I mean, that was the kind of principle, and it goes back to, you know, to Europe at the time, you know, and the colonializations of, you know, the new worlds and the old worlds and what have you, with the philosophy is that, you know, we can take the land, because if you can't defend it, then you don't really deserve to have it. And, you know, that led, of course, to slavery. It led to, you know, the issues with Native Americans, you know, and, you know, it leads to, when you take them to an environmental situation. I saw at some point, I forget exactly where I saw this, that there was a picture of, I guess, you know, North America at one time, you know, before it was colonized, and it had lots of trees. And there was a lot going on. And when you look at it today, and you look at how all the natural resources have been taken out, and, you know, the trees have been cut down, you know, again, it was all in the, you know, for the purpose of, you know, capitalism, you know, basically. And I am a capitalist. So, you know, don't get me wrong. You know, I do kind of believe in, you know, free market and, you know, being able to, you know, to have opportunities. But when you take a look at that philosophy to the extreme, I think it flows through the mindset of, you know, of this country, you know, the governing folks from the beginning. And it's still here. And we, you know, we tend, I think, as a country to look at people in a way that if you are down and out, even though we say everybody's got an opportunity to be held, you know, get up by their bootstrap, on the other hand, we hold it against them and say, well, you know, if you can't do it, then you really don't deserve to have it, without really looking at the fundamentals. You know, for instance, slavery, for instance. You know, how do you have people in slavery for 300 years? You turn them loose, but you don't give them anything to try to help them get on their feet. But then you blame them, you know, for not being able, you know, to get up to speed. So, you know, there's a lot of different issues that's underlying this. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox again.
Can I offer an alternative perspective from someone? I would call myself a socialist, not a capitalist. And I think there's so much about the free market. I don't know if any of you have ever read Mike Consol's book, Freedom from the Markets. It's a really great book, and how he kind of talks about that. Essentially, just like Americans have been fooled into this zero-sum ideology, that we've also been forced to participate in a market that is not based on equality, and it's not we don't have equal access to the market. And I think that's like an inherent flaw with our American based capitalism, that are, you know, it's hard to be able to do all of this social justice reform we need to do when we're all operating in what I think is an oppressive economic system. It's a huge barrier.
You were starting to say something.
I was thinking about something that author said, which also tied to something you said earlier. Linda, I'm looking, Linda or Lindsay?
Lindsay.
Sorry, I wanted to call you Linda. I apologize, Lindsay. It was thinking about when you were speaking about the decision, how people vote and how we tend to vote on moral issues. I mean, we tend to vote on these one issues, and how we've made certain things moral, right or wrong, but we don't see poverty or the inequities as a moral issue. We don't see that as right or wrong. And I think it's that something that you were speaking to, author, around there's this belief or this misconception that everyone is on the equal playing field, that if I can do it, why can't you do it? And I think one of the things I was listening to, one of the interviews that Heather did, was just really highlighting all of the systemic inequities that were created to really level up a population and really keep a population out. And I don't know if people really, if everyone looks at these things the same way, if everyone is really unlearning, because I think that we have a lot of unlearning to do in our country, if that makes sense, around, relearning, because one of the things you just said, Lindsay, I'm like, I just wrote the book down because I feel like that's something I want to look up. But I think that I don't know if we invest in really learning and understanding the historical context and how the system has been created, if that makes sense.
Well, that kind of plays right into, though, all the pushback for critical race theory, don't you think? I mean, in many ways, I feel like this book is about critical race theory in the sense of really having us understand how laws programmed by and design of programs and laws have really done a disservice. And that people don't understand that. Certainly the white majority, has no real appreciation for how they have done what you just said, you know, propped up one part of society or the population, and almost intentionally, intentionally, maybe not almost intentionally, but intentionally keeping other populations down.
And I also wonder, as you say that, like, an identity has been formed through that privilege. And I think that if we talk about critical race theory and we naming these things, it's almost like this, I wonder if there's this fear of stripping of, I don't want to get into like patriotic, like I don't want to get into, I want to be mindful because I don't want to offend, or I may not know enough to say something, but it's like this stripping of identity of who we are as a race, that we don't want to let go of that. How dare you pour blood on my history or my understanding of what my history is and who I have been able to be because of my history. This is what I've been able to do, and how dare you take that from me? Whereas on the other side, there's been a group of people that have lived through shame, the same history. It has not been a privilege. It has been shame and condemnation and the stripping of an identity. And so and people have seen that. And so I don't want that to be me, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if I was clear, but some of my thoughts around it.
Yeah. So I'm doing some work right now with a California state agency, a major state agency. And one of the things that, some of you know, I do employee engagement work, and I've been doing these focus groups at multiple levels within this particular agency. And a big focus has been on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So one of the things that has come out of these focus groups was the fact that the Black employees wrote a letter about 9 months ago, just out of frustration that they felt like there wasn't a level playing field within this agency for opportunities for promotion, for developmental opportunities, and they were just frustrated by this. Now, this is an agency where the majority of people are PhDs, extremely well-educated, highly educated workforce. And what came out of one or two of the focus groups was in all the focus groups, people feel like this particular agency does not treat people fairly. And no one feels they have equal access to opportunities. They don't feel like there's good communication. They don't feel like they're treated with respect. They don't feel like their opinion matters. Their input hasn't been sought. And even people who feel like they've done a lot in terms of their education feel like they're not valued for their education. And what was interesting was I had a couple of focus groups with just the Black or African-American Black affinity groups to talk to them about issues within the agency. And then I've had a lot of focus groups that were very mixed population or largely white, because it's pretty much a white agency. What I have found very interesting is that a lot of the white people looked at that Black employee's letter and said, I feel the same way. I just think it's so interesting. They feel that they don't have equal access. They don't feel like they're treated with respect. They don't feel like, so all of the problems that the Black population within this agency and how they were able to articulate it and describe in terms of what they feel the organization really needs to think about. The vast majority of all others feel the same way. And it was interesting because it's like the first time where I'm talking to people and they can relate to each other on something that has typically been viewed as pretty much a bias within just one population. So to me, I have a little bit of hope in this agency in terms of whether this means that we actually can all work together to deal with a system that needs to be improved, right? Because we all realize we could benefit from it. Pretty much her thesis, McGhee's thesis, because everybody sees that they want it and they can benefit from it. Pretty much nobody criticized the Black employees letter. They all believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that this agency really needs to put front and center, not just because of how the employees feel, but this is an agency whose mission is also directly related to environmental justice because of climate change and air quality, air pollutants, and their concern that, and pretty much it wasn't just certain populations that felt this agency needed to begin to relate better to the people they serve. Everyone, even the whites, believe they need to understand better how they relate to communities, especially communities of color or poverty, where we have huge problems with health issues, right? Because of asthma, with air pollutants in particular. And they realize they don't know how to communicate in those communities to be able to serve the population better. So this is the first time where I've seen something that is kind of moving in the direction of where McGhee thinks we should be moving. The sad thing is that nobody thinks this agency's leadership is that good. You know? Go ahead.
I was going to pop in here because it sounds like you've got a really good opportunity here. Are you going to function as a change agent? I mean, can you present the results of your focus groups to management? Because it sounds like there's a culture, that is driven by, certain norms and values, and that's exclusive of everybody. But you have found evidence where people who have, different backgrounds agree on a common issue. And, I'm putting myself in a consultant role here, but, maybe you can present this data, to the powers that be and just confront them, with what you have heard. You don't have to reveal, who said what or anything, or, which group, but you can actually confront them with this information. Also, you have a way for them to make repairs or change direction, or at least maybe start some groups where people get together. There's so much power in groups,
Yeah.
and, we've got this common ground. These are some things that we can agree on, and in spite of what our leadership is, we're going to make it happen. But you are in a really good spot, it looks like, where you can actually begin to make some fundamental changes in that culture.
Well, I mean, that is why I'm doing the focus groups. The leadership asked that we do this. So, but the real question is, does the leadership have the wherewithal to actually change when they are confronted with this information, right? So that's a really big issue.
Maybe you could leverage the groups, though, even if they can agree that, yeah, we're not doing things right, we're making a lot of mistakes here that we shouldn't be making. Maybe you can leverage the groups and that power that they have to sort of implement some changes on their own, where they themselves have these emergent leaders of change, but at least they've got the, the willpower to make it happen. All they need is kind of like the support from the top down. And if they know that the leaders know that they've got to change, you've got a lot going for you right there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is the whole trajectory of what I'm trying to do with these focus groups. But a lot of the people I'm talking to are people who have no real power. They have a little bit of voice, but these are people that are at the supervisory and below level within the organization. They're not the very senior level of the organization. But yeah, I'm going to try to do all of that to see if we can bring change here. I bring it up because I feel like maybe, and I'm going to tag it to COVID. But the other thing that I'm really seeing in my work is that remote work, telework, and the fact that now organizations are starting to bring people back into the office, and they don't have often a really good reason for why to bring people back into the office. When people have gotten used to the flexibility and the work-life balance they've been able to deal with when they have a chance to work at home or have greater flexibility with their work. I think this whole workplace flexibility issue is going to be another common issue that is not going to be based on race, but that everyone benefits from it. And the people who normally would have thought they would have been taken care of, the white majority, are feeling they're just as disenfranchised because the way the decisions are being made, it's for reasons that have nothing to do with what's best for mission delivery, for productivity, for the health of their employees. And in the case of this one agency, reducing air pollutants because they're not driving to work, right? So they could actually contribute to the very part of the mission that they exist for. So I think it's going to be interesting. We should watch this whole back to work in the office versus remote work issue, because we know this great resignation and the fact that people are deciding that they want to leave their jobs because they don't feel that their organizations are giving them the flexibility that they have gotten used to and see it as a positive benefit, not just for themselves, but for their organizations. It could be another opportunity for us to come together and fight for something that is good for people, right? And good for society. So it'll be interesting, and it could be one of those multicultural, multiracial coalitions, like what McGhee talks about. Much more at an organic level, much more at a grassroots level, but something that might actually be able to create some steam and some power.
I do think there have to be a level of comfort though there. I mean, especially when you're talking about in the workplace. I can tell you for myself personally, I don't feel comfortable talking about race. I never have. Even, we've had forums before in the workplace where they tried to bring us together to have conversations. It just did not work. For whatever reasons, people just held on to whatever their beliefs were. And it just didn't work. So I think you have to begin first with making people comfortable having the conversation before you can even get anywhere. You have to start there first, especially when you're talking about bringing groups together. Start with that comfort level first. And then maybe you can move toward making some sort of changes there. But if you can't get past that comfort level, I don't think you're gonna have much movement in that area.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that a lot of work done with like learning about cultural differences and the actual like keyword I'm blanking on, but as like a government employee, you do a lot of those trainings and those diversity and equity trainings. And work is like, it's important for all of those things, to apply everywhere and especially the workplace, but it's a weird place to take part in that stuff, if that makes sense. Like, working in, and I'm a school teacher, so it's like equity is a huge part of my job, but sometimes these equity trainings are kind of not run very well, not made very well, and I think a lot of people take it on as a like one more thing I have to do, or another training or another meeting I have to go to, and people don't come to the table like willing and ready to want to do that kind of thinking and reflecting, then it's not going to be genuine and not going to be real. So like it's like an important thing to happen, but like it's such a I don't know if like the workplace is the most conducive place for it, but it's the only place that can catch everyone, I guess. Like it's a weird, I think, kind of like I don't know what I'm trying to say, but like
I think it is hard at work, but I do think that work does not mean that it's still not showing up there for everyone. The inequities still show up at work, the biases, the prejudice, the challenges that we're talking about that exist in our world most definitely should still show up in the workplace. And I think as I was listening to you, Judy, it makes me think about what is the work with the leaders for learning, unlearning, and really becoming aware, really thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but also really anti-racism and dismantling white supremacy. And really having a historical context and understanding. It's like, it's almost like that undoing racism training. Has anyone ever done undoing racism? It's like this 3-day training that starts you all the way down here and it gives you this, starts broad and brings you in, and then you're looking at yourself. But they do it in such a skilled way that it's almost like it catches you. But I also would say that I don't know if anyone is ever going to get to a place where they're 100% comfortable having these conversations, but it doesn't mean we don't have the conversations. How do we create a space where we can have hard and courageous conversations where there's some level of safety to have the conversation, but it doesn't guarantee comfort? Because I do think that it's important for people to become uncomfortable. I do think that we have to get uncomfortable because the things that we're living through right now are not comfortable for many people. People have been living through discomfort for centuries, and they've had to suffer it and they've had to go through it. So I want to be mindful of shying away from the conversation because now a new group is going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. You know, people bring their biases and prejudices to work with them, you know, from the outside. And I don't know, something that I've experienced, you know, in the workplace, and I think even, you know, from a military standpoint, when you get a group of people together and they're under stress and they have a common issue that's going on, they come together. And in a lot of ways, some of the biases that they had on the outside, you know, they find that, you know, their coworkers, you know, because of what they have in common, you know, they worked well together and they solve it. Once the problem is solved and people go back outside again, they're back into their own environment. And sometimes that doesn't get carried over, you know, back into the old environment. Or what happens is that it's selective. It's like, well, okay, you're not quite like everybody else, so I accept you. So we can be, we can be on a different level, but that doesn't apply to everybody. So it doesn't go that way. But you know, I think when you get people with a common mission and a common challenge, they do bind, and they do really, I think, start to see that when we work together, we can overcome this. But it only lasts just for that little section, and they don't seem to take it out and apply it, you know, generally in a lot of ways. Now, that's not everybody, of course, but you know, that's been my experience. But unfortunately, you know, I've got to go at 7:30. But this has been a great conversation, and I've enjoyed it. And I'm sure if I could stay for the next half an hour or so more, it would be even greater. But I want to thank everybody for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Art.
Okay.
You know, this common, the issue of working on something in common, I think is really important. The thing that I was picking up on and trying to communicate about this one place that I'm working with, where the whites are reacting to the Black employee letter and saying, we feel the same way. Part of what came out of the conversations I had was that the white people I was talking to, began to understand how others feel. They did not like the way they were feeling, being disenfranchised, not being treated fairly. And it was a glimpse into, it was like a reveal. Because when they read the Black employees letter, they realized, oh my gosh, I feel exactly the same way and I don't like it, right? And it's not right, it's not fair. So yeah, there's a common area where we can focus aspirationally on fixing things, but I do think it's also stepping back and putting ourselves, trying to figure out how we all put ourselves at the place at which the hurt is, to some extent, because until you feel the hurt, you really can't put yourself in a place of understanding why that hurt is something nobody wants and we shouldn't allow. I mean, in this book, for those of you that read it, she talks about these public goods, like the swimming pool. She uses the swimming pool idea, where there were these swimming pools that were built after during the Roosevelt administration, when it was like a public works project. And these were wonderful places where the community came together. It was a fun thing for families to engage in, but they were segregated. And after there was a move to desegregate these pools because they were for public good, public money was being spent, it should be open up to everybody, then the white majority decided to close those pools, destroy them, fill them up with concrete and put grass over them, without any recognition of the hurt that they didn't even think about the hurt, what they were losing out of this. And so part of it's trying to figure out, as part of the narrative or part of the work any of us do, it without blaming or shaming, trying to figure out how we all feel the hurt, so that hurt may help us figure out that common feeling is something that none of us wants, and no one wants us to share with anybody else. And we really need to figure out how we get to a point where it's gets us to the common good, But I don't think we can get to the common good if some people can't put themselves in the shoes of the hurt.
She also speaks about that when I listen to the interview, and I apologize if I don't explain it the way she explains it, when she talks about the student loan debt and how when it was only individuals that were white getting an education, it was free. But when you have all of these different groups now going for an education, it now costs these exorbitant costs. And now we have people across all races with trillions of dollars in student loan debt, and how that as a whole has really hurt all of us. And I don't know if I explained, I just recall her mentioning that in her interview.
It was powerful. I agree with you. Yeah. And it not just hurts us today. For many of those people, it hurts them in perpetuity. They can't buy houses. They can't do much of anything because they're just strapped with this horrible debt. And I do think it's interesting when I talk to people about erasing that debt, how strongly people feel if they felt like their education, they were able to pay off their debt, or they don't have debt, how much they feel that it's not fair for somebody else to get something they didn't get. And I was talking to a girlfriend of mine about the fact that often those very people had some sort of opportunity, either wealthy parents or some other thing that allowed them to get a benefit, and they don't even understand they got the benefit. They don't know that they actually benefited from something. They're just looking right now that they don't have debt. Why should I take care of somebody else's debt? It's so interesting how it's difficult for people who've had white or wealth benefits that they cannot see that as an inherent reason why they are where they are and the success that they have. So, that there never was a level playing field even for them, even though they may have thought there was. Nikki, we haven't heard much from you. I know you were talking about you have a young child. Do you want to weigh in on what we've been talking about?
Hi, everyone. I've been enjoying listening to all of the comments. I have not read the book, but I wanted to join in tonight and at least hear what everyone had to say. I work for the City of Falls Church, and I serve on our racial equity action team. And so I'm always looking for opportunities to engage in conversation or listen and learn, or, hear a new resource on the topic. So I'm grateful to be here tonight, and I appreciate what everyone has to say.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
One book that I don't know, I doubt if it's easy for us to find because it's so old, but it came up in her book, McGhee's book, and also in an interview that I saw. It's a book written by this guy, Hinton Rowan Helper. He wrote it in 1857. And that was a book where he was talking about how whites, that with the movement away from slavery, with the abolishment of slavery, the decisions that whites were making were not in their best interest, that they were doing it to hurt others, but in fact, they were hurting themselves. So McGhee was talking about the fact that this was even way back then. We were doing what we're doing today as a country. We're making decisions that are not in our best interest. And, Lindsay made a really great point of trying to figure out, questioning, why is it that people will vote against their interests? When in fact, their interests are so significant, even, beyond the one issue voter kind of thing, but that there are so many issues that especially white America would really want to and do support, whether it's single payer, right, for Medicare for all, student loan debt forgiveness. I mean, there are a lot of things that they want, but they still vote for people who are completely opposed to it. Why? Why would we do that? Why do people do that?
I don't know, Judy, but I liked your, your idea that unless we can feel the pain of other people, we don't find the common ground. We don't reach out to them. And it occurred to me that a lot of times people are aware of this pain, but they have ways to block that pain. They will engage in very dysfunctional behaviors. They'll try to make themselves, look different, feel different, act different, get better benefits, because they don't really want to acknowledge that they have this pain at all. And so they just completely block it out. And it's a very bad excuse, I think, for them and for the other persons, because it's actually a lie that they're deceiving themselves. They don't really feel, genuine pain. And when they do, it's kind of like, no, I don't feel that way, because if I felt that way, I would be putting myself in the category of this other person. So, but we're dealing with blockages all the time. These conspiracy theories are just filled with it. They try to create these scenarios where, in some way they come out, looking better than what they actually are. So it's a form of deception. Yeah, but unless we feel that pain and act on it, and not disguise it, we'll come out the winners.
One of the things that McGhee talks about is Truth and Reconciliation Commission, something called a truth effort. I wondered, I know most haven't read the book, but I thought it was interesting that she's feeling like that's one of the ways in which we can heal. One of the ways in which we bring things out in the open and then figure out, after bringing it out in the open, that we can try to address those things. It also involves some reparation, or the concept of reparation. And I wondered whether anybody had any thoughts about that, as, just weighing in on that as a potential solution.
I just Googled it real quick. And it looks like South Africa is set up by a government entity. And I think that in our country, is our government willing to acknowledge and take ownership of what has happened in this country? For it to happen at that level, I think that there has to be an acknowledgement at that level, if that makes sense, and a willingness to, because I've been thinking about power and how this system really is benefiting a group of people. And yes, I know that all races are definitely impacted by this, but there's a group that benefits for keeping this way. Mm-hmm. And there's an unwillingness to release that power. And so I don't know, like I'm going to read up on that a little bit more, but that was the first thing that struck me when I took a look at it real quick.
Foucault has a lot to say about that, Michel Foucault, he was, about power and its dynamics and, suppression and things like that. If you're going to read up on power, that's the one I go to, as a beginning.
Well, it's not too far in the distant future. It's 2042 when the majority switches. That's 20 years away. That's only 20 years away. And I'm really wondering what we could do in the next 20 years to make sure that we are a country that really is prepared for this in a way that's healthy, constructive, positive. Otherwise, who knows what we're going to be dealing with, civil war or whatever. And of course, some people think we may be in a civil war today to some extent, but only 20 years away. If government was going to do something right, it would be to begin to prepare for and think about how we position ourselves to be a country that is much more of a different majority, and how do we handle that? It's going to come much sooner than we expect. You know, and I do think that's some of the pressure of what we're dealing with today, is the fear of a white majority facing that inevitable outcome and trying to figure out how they can stick their heels in and figure out how they can hold off on that thing somehow. But yeah, we shouldn't go into this with the blinders on. I mean, we ought to be talking about what we need to be doing as a country and as a society with this. And I don't feel like anybody's really talking about that. Well, even though all of us didn't read the book, I mean, this book is powerful. I mean, it is just powerful. And there's so much evidence in this book that's grounded in not just history, but data, in a way that is compelling, you know, so that it is so much more than just anecdotal. It's so much more than just the story or opinion of somebody. And what a service I feel McGhee has done in writing a book like this. I mean, who knows who's reading it? You know, who knows how much exposure there is to a book like this, but gosh, if we could just get some portion of our society that would normally not read this kind of book to read it, just to open their minds up a little bit, what a much better place we could be.
I think people are ignorant and they don't know they're ignorant. You know, and that is the saddest part, you know, knowing that you have this gap, you know, bringing up things that are undiscussable, putting them out on the table. That's the first step, but a lot of people don't even get there, and you know, they just remain in this not even blissful ignorance. And it's unfortunately going to have some pretty dire consequences. You know, we're seeing bits and pieces of it right now, but you know, unless people really are aware and wake up and realize that we have to make those changes, it's not going to be good for any of us, I think.
I do think we have to be really mindful of a point that Connie, you were making in terms of the discomfort of talking about some of these things in the workplace. And the folks that I've talked to in the work that I'm doing, especially people of color, there's a level of frustration that I'm feeling about them feeling like they're the ones who have to defend things. They're the ones who have to educate. They're the ones who have to explain things over and over and over again. I mean, how long do we have to explain these things, right? And then why is it our job to do that? Is the message that I'm hearing. Organizations have to really think through how they engage on these topics, and that they're not putting undue stress and pressure on the very people that we need to figure out how we bring into the tent effectively, and not be people who feel like they've got to constantly defend something that they shouldn't be the ones defending. You know, the whole of society should be trying to defend this, and certainly the leadership within organizations need to be defending these things if they've got their heads screwed on right. They really do understand the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we want to change our society and our organizations. But it sure is putting a great deal of pressure on the shoulders of people that to me is unfair.
I think we had to, at my last position, I was on our equity. We had an equity council. We called it Leadership, Equity, Accountability, and Diversity. And this was something that we definitely grappled with. And we had to find out who are our allies, and finding our allies in the work. And we had this phrase, because we had been having we call them courageous conversations. And we had really shifted our mission to really name social and racial justice, and trying to move towards what does an anti-racist organization looks like. And so we were having a lot of these conversations, and what you're naming Judy, is real. Like it gets to this place where, why do I have to be the person that has to speak on this? Why is the question coming to me? Why do I have to address this once again? Here we are in this space again, and we have to deal with this once again. And it allowed us to start thinking about who are the allies in this space where I can step back and someone else steps up. And so we had this little phrase that we kind of coined at the equity table, white people get your people. And it was kind of like, because we had some people in the space, like we created two affinity groups. One was a Black people that identified as Black African American. And then we had a white anti-racism affinity group, where people that were identified as white, where they were doing their work together and really thinking about that was their safe space, because it creates fear, it creates a lot of questions and concerns for everyone. But that was their space where they could do their work. And we in the other group had their space where they could do their work, and really thinking about how they're showing up in this work joint with with everyone else.
The other thing that I've observed in the work that I'm doing out in California, and it's not just with this one agency, I'm working with several cities, counties, retirement boards. So there's about 6 or 7 entities I'm working with. And the thing that's refreshing for me compared to working over here on the East Coast is there's much greater awareness among the people I'm interacting with, whether that's really it's only based on who I'm interacting with, right? So who knows that, there may be others that are going to speak the way the people out there speak. But what has been so refreshing is to hear from white employees about white supremacy in the leadership of those organizations. They're the ones who are saying we have been white dominated and we need to understand how to change, and so whether, and they don't have the one group I'm thinking of right at this moment, they don't have a white employees affinity group, the anti-racism affinity group, but they have some definitely white anti-racist people who are willing to speak out, which would go into that category of allies that you were talking about, Keisha. But it's so refreshing to be talking about something, and for people that are white to be able to completely see the very thing that others, non-whites, have seen and maybe have tried to express, or have decided it's not worth expressing because nobody's listening. But that we have these folks that are willing to speak up, and that they aren't just speaking up, they see it, they understand it, they realize it, they know how deep it is, they know what it's going to take to change it. So for me, that shows that there's some movement in areas that I think that we need way more of, but at least it was reassuring that I had more people talking like that in some of my focus groups within this one entity than I'd had in almost any other entity that I'd worked with here on the East Coast. Yeah.
There is hope.
There is hope, but yeah, it's still very much a uphill battle, because we do have, most organizations have pretty arcane leadership, still a command and control. Your presence is productivity, meaning seats in the desk, seats in the office rather than working from home. Very old school kind of mentality. And I had hoped that COVID and all the learning from COVID in terms of using technology and being able to work from home in a way that's been very effective, because people have collaborated more. There's been more sort of level playing field, because more people can attend meetings, more people are invited to those meetings, that geography isn't keeping them from being in those meetings, right? So there's been a lot of really cool learning that's occurred, a lot of good experience that's occurred, but I can't tell that the leadership in some of these organizations are enlightened by that. I think there's such comfort in how business as usual was the old business, rather than to understand what the new better needs to look like.
And also wonder how much of that is a level of distrust of I know that was something that we grappled with in my last organization, this feeling of, are people really working? This level of distrust of what people are doing if we don't actually see them at their desk doing the work. So it's like, how do we get to a place where we trust that people are doing the work?
And to be able to do things that are part of an accountability model that says, we're talking, we're seeing the results, we have ways of measuring performance.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these organizations don't measure performance. A lot of those organizations don't evaluate performance. There's a lot missing in terms of what we would normally see in a healthy organization seems to be missing in some of these organizations. But you're right. If they don't see you, then they think you're not working. And of course, these are people who only see certain people too. That's the other problem.
Yeah.
Because they're not so comfortable talking to the entire workforce. They only talk to who they want to talk to. And that's not good either.
That's a whole other story.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So Whitney, anything you want to say about what we've been talking about, the book, anything to your reactions to things?
I've just been taking notes and listening to everyone. I thought there were a lot of really good points made. I loved the book. I thought it was really awesome. I'm not finished with it yet, but I plan to finish. One thing that stuck out, the two things I guess that stuck out for me, and Art touched on it when we first got on, was the propaganda. And the power of propaganda, and over the years how that has been able to change so many things. And you get this one line, it's simplified, and I guess that's part of also what I was thinking about, is like why people vote. They vote for one issue. They just vote for one issue that they pick. People want to simplify things. Our brains can't handle a whole lot of too much gray area. And for some people, it's just much easier to just simplify it. This is wrong, that's that, and whatever. And so I was just thinking about that, and then the power of propaganda, how that plays into it over the years, how that's been able to, you pick the one thing that people say is wrong, or you pick the one thing that you want to be wrong, and you pit everyone against it by simplifying it down to this tiny little thing. And the thing that comes up for me, I work in the mental health care industry, and I work for an association for mental health counselors, and like that's in the healthcare industry all the time. And she referenced it in the book, as the American Medical Association just picked and said, at one point they just picked and said, no, don't do this. And then from then on, we just haven't done it. They just were able to use this line, like, no, this is bad. But also the part that, that you guys touched on before as well, is the pools and student debt and healthcare. I think she covered all of that in the same chapter, or the same area of the book at the front. And I kept thinking, what kept running through my head is, what would the world look like if it had been different? Like if one of those things had been different, or if two of those things had been different, if the pools hadn't closed, what would it look like today, now, 40 years later? Or if student debt was more on a different playing scale, or healthcare, like where would we be now? Going back to like the title of her book, like the sum of us, how much different would we look? What would our sum be now if some of those things weren't, how much farther, what would we, I don't know, just what would it look like now? Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, that's powerful. And Paula, you've been quiet too. Anything that you wanted to weigh in on or mention about what we've been talking about?
Hi, everyone. So something that I could relate to that was being discussed was the employers not trusting their their employees, because I definitely, me and others in my current office have definitely sensed that from management. I'm in the middle of like transitioning to another office within my agency, so they didn't make me go back this week, these last couple weeks that I'm still in this office, but there's definitely been a sense that like, oh, if you don't come on your designated day, that's going to be looked upon as like suspicious. Like if you're always taking off, like you need to make sure to come in on that day. And my supervisor is definitely the type that is like, wants to be in the office because she likes the interactions. But then like, if the work is being done, then like, why can't employees be trusted? And our office is competing with other grant offices within our agency because the other offices are offering more flexibilities, and there's been a ton of turnover recently, myself included, who's leaving in 2 weeks. So that, and then you mentioned like you're doing focus groups, and my division is doing focus groups again. Like they did it back in fall 2020, and they have this consultant, and I talked to the consultant about the things that I think are wrong with what I've seen, and then now they're doing it again, and it seems like there isn't a ton of participation because they keep like reminding everybody, oh, these things are available, we really want to hear from you. But like, you just did this like a year and a half ago, and now you're doing it again. And when they had gone over the results of what they found the last time, our division director was dismissive on certain things. So like, why would anyone participate again if you're just doing this? It seems like they're just doing it to say that they're going to do something, but like no one feels like anything is actually going to change.
Mm-hmm.
So it's challenging if management is not really putting in the effort. Like the employees, the burden's on the employees to, oh, you must speak up, like you have to tell us what's wrong. But like, why bother if it hasn't changed?
Right. That is a really big issue. And you get to a point where you don't trust leadership. If they're asking your opinion, they don't do anything about it. Yeah. And, we see a decline in people wanting to participate in things when they feel like their voice isn't heard, which worries me about voting sometimes, in terms of whether we will get people in the mid year elections versus the presidential elections, and how people's voices and what they're trying to get their representatives or their members of Congress to do. And if nothing happens, then they basically become very apathetic.
It's kind
I
of
think
like
until you do, I was gonna say, I think until you do a 360 on the supervisors where you see any change, because the climate surveys don't work. But I think the 360s does. We did the 360s when I was at Penn State University, where, I was rated by my supervisor, and her supervisor sent me an evaluation to rate her. Until you do the 360s, I don't think you will see too much. Like you say, you'll get them and you won't see any change. But if you start doing the 360s, you'll see something change.
I think that's a really good point, Connie. We did those at our last agency, and our equity council advocated that for accountability piece be added, that our executive director had to share hers with the board chair and create a plan. And then she had to review all of the executive teams and create a plan. And because it's a great tool, but we wanted to make sure that people were putting some action behind what they were learning about their styles. So thank you for naming that, Connie. That's a really good tool.
Yeah. And Carol, you started to say something. I'll let you have the last word now.
I don't know. It sounds like a self-defeating cycle, where, people do not trust their leaders. The leaders don't trust the employees. And, it spirals down unless, I don't know, I got to thinking too, the closer that leaders get to the actual situation, the more empathy they feel. That's why we do a lot of simulations and in training and all of that. And sometimes hearing the stories of people, is enough to really make them involved in whatever those other people are facing. So anytime you can bring the information, the data closer to these people, the more you'll see some shifts. But otherwise, this survey thing, it's another way that they distance themselves from the employees, and make the excuse that, oh yeah, we've done something about it, let's move on, and it's kind of like, this self-defeating prophecy.
So these focus groups I do enough of them that I can speak to the heads of the departments. And I do one-on-one feedback and coaching to those individual department heads, because it's not a perfect 360, but it's feedback that they don't otherwise get. And it is a way for us to try to get them to maybe begin to own up things that they own responsibility for things that they need to do. So Nancy, thanks for joining us. And I know we've run out of time. We've gone over 8 o'clock. So I'm going to let everybody go. Thanks for participating. I know some of you are very busy. So thank you so much for participating in this conversation. And Keisha and I will have to put our heads together with maybe ideas for the next book. If you guys have any ideas for another book that we might do in a few months, let us know, because I'd like to keep doing this.
This was great. Thank you, Keisha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great. Thank you.
Yep. See you guys. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.